The vampire had been blown to pieces across half of London, and he came back together laughing. 500 years he had waited. 500 years of tearing through armies, monsters, and men of God, searching for a single opponent strong enough to give him the one thing immortality had stolen, a real death. And now, standing in the ruins of his own splattered body, Alucard stared at the unremarkable bald man who had done it with one casual punch. A hero from another universe who only wanted a decent fight and a cheaper grocery bill. And the monster understood that his prayer had finally been answered. The hero's prayer had been answered too. Only one of them would survive both. The village of Cheddar died on a night without stars. It happened the way such things always happened in that hidden, bleeding England quietly at first. A priest gone strange, a church gone silent, a handful of villagers who stopped answering their doors. Then the screaming began, and by the time the fog rolled down off the hills and swallowed the last streetlight, there was no longer a village at all. There was only a feeding ground. The dead walked its lanes in shuffling packs, what remained of farmers and shopkeepers and children, their eyes burned out to embers, their mouths still wet ghouls, the discarded leftovers of a vampire's appetite, mindless and hungry and growing in number with every villager they pulled down into the dark. This was the England the daylight world was never allowed to see, a country with two histories, one written in books and one written in blood and buried by an organization whose name appeared in no public record. In a manor outside London, in a war room older than most nations, that organization was already moving. Reports flowed in by encrypted channel. Cheddar Village, total loss. Ghoul count exceeding 100. Source vampire active and uncontained. Sir Integra Fairbrook Wingate's Hellsing read the dispatches by lamplight with a cigar burning low between her fingers, and her orders went out in the calm, cold voice of a woman whose family had been fighting the Midnight War for 100 years. The monsters were loose again, and Hellsing would do what Hellsing had always done. But on that particular night without stars, as the fog thickened over the dying village and the dead dragged themselves toward the last living girl left inside it, something happened that appeared in no protocol, no archive, and no nightmare the Midnight War had ever recorded. A hole opened in the sky above Cheddar, and a man fell out of it complaining. He came down through the fog without grace and without ceremony, landed in the village square hard enough to crack the cobblestones, and stood up rubbing the back of his head. A man of average height and unimpressive build, bald as an egg, dressed in a yellow jumpsuit with red gloves and a white cape that had seen too many washes. He looked around at the fog, the gutted houses, the corpses, the shambling silhouettes of the dead converging on him from every lane, and his face, a face of almost supernatural plainness, registered the whole gothic nightmare of it with the expression of a man reading a disappointing menu. "Cold," Saitama said to no one. He rubbed his bare arms. "Why is it so cold? It was summer 5 minutes ago." He squinted at the fog. "And foggy, great. I knew that weird portal thing looked sketchy." The ghouls reached him. They came the way they came for everyone, a wall of dead flesh and ember eyes, dozens of them, the devoured remains of an entire village, moaning out of the fog with their wet mouths open. It was a sight that had broken trained soldiers. Hellsing's own troopers, armed and armored and briefed, had been known to freeze before a ghoul pack and die screaming. The horror of them was not their strength. It was their faces, the faces of postmen and grandmothers and choir boys, still recognizable, still human enough to make a man hesitate the half-second that killed him. Saitama looked at the approaching wall of the dead, and he sighed, the deep, put-upon sigh of a man whose evening has developed a complication. "Zombies," he said, "seriously, zombies." He glanced around the empty square as if hoping someone would appear to take responsibility. "Where even is this? This is the most depressing place I've ever. Okay, you know what, fine. He hit the first one with the very smallest fraction of a punch. A lazy, backhanded thing, the kind of gesture another man might use to wave off a fly. What happened next, the official Hellsing report would later struggle to phrase. The ghoul did not fall. The ghoul ceased, burst into a cloud of dust and ash that blew backward through the pack behind it, and the shockwave of the gesture, the displaced air of one board backhand, tore down the lane like a cannon blast and took 11 more ghouls apart on its way. The fog itself recoiled, shoved bodily out of the square. Windows that had S. Survived the village's death shattered in a ring 2 streets deep. Saitama looked at the dust drifting where a dozen of the dead had been, and his shoulders slumped. "One hit," he said, in the flat tone of a man confirming his deepest disappointment about the universe. Of course, even the spooky fog zombies. One hit. The rest of the pack came on, mindless, incapable of understanding what the dust in the air meant. He went through them the way a man walks through a beaded curtain. He did not perform. He did not pose. He strolled across the ruined square, swatting the converged dead of an entire village into ash with all the urgency of someone brushing crumbs off a table. And the gothic horror that had consumed Cheddar, the nightmare that had taken 100 lives and would have taken 1,000 more, simply ended, in under a minute, at the hands of a man who spent the entire massacre wondering aloud whether anywhere around here sold food this late. At the far end of the square, pinned against a wall with a dead man's hands inches from her throat, a young police officer named Sira's Victoria watched a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit flicker attacker into powder, and her mind, already cracked by the night's horrors, quietly gave up trying. "Oh," Saitama said, noticing her. "Hey, you're alive, that's good." He looked around at the ash settling over the cobblestones. "So, weird question, what country is this?" Sira's made a sound that was not quite language. "Right," Saitama said. "You've had a rough night, sorry." He patted her shoulder awkwardly twice like a man who had read about comforting people in a manual. "It's fine now. The zombies are dead. Well, deader." He paused, struck by a genuinely troubling thought. "Man, I hope they take my money here." And that was how it began. The strangest file ever opened in the long, blood-soaked archive of the Midnight War. Because the night was not over, and the vampire who had murdered Cheddar was still in his church on the hill, and the world's true monsters were already turning their attention toward the village where every reading had just gone wrong at once. In the Hellsing war room, the instruments had registered the event as an explosion, then revised themselves because explosions did not walk. Integra stood over the feeds as her analysts replayed the satellite thermal imagery again and again. An entire ghoul outbreak, 100+ signatures, erased in 54 seconds by a single source that read, on every spectrum they possessed as an ordinary human being. No demonic signature, no sorcery, no vampiric energy. The most cataclysmic force her organization had ever recorded on English soil, and the instruments insisted, with the flat stubbornness of machines, that it was a man. "That's impossible," her analyst said quietly. "Obviously," Integra said. She did not look away from the screen, where the bald figure could be seen, grainy, gray, infuriatingly casual, strolling out of the ash of 100 ghouls with his hands in the small of his back, stretching. A century of her family's war had taught her the taxonomy of the dark by heart. Vampires, ghouls, freaks, regenerators, the engineered horrors of old enemies. Every threat had a category. Every category had a protocol. The thing on her screen had neither, and Integra Hellsing had been raised from childhood on a single iron principle: that the unknown was the only thing in the Midnight War that deserved the word dangerous. She lit a fresh cigar with hands that did not shake, because she did not permit them to. "Get me everything," she said, "and wake him." No one in the room asked who him was. There was only one him in the Hellsing organization. The thing in the sub-basement, the leashed nightmare. The monster her family kept chained in the dark to be aimed at other monsters. The order traveled down through the manor like a cold draft, down past the wine cellars, past the armory, to the deep place where the shadows did not behave, and the temperature fell for no reason the engineers could ever find. And in that deep dark, something that had been still for a long time opened its eyes, twin points of red in an ocean of black, and felt the night, the way a spider feels a tremor at the far edge of its web. Something new was walking in England, something the dark could not read. The thing in the basement began, slowly, to smile. But Hellsing's instruments were not the only ones watching the night, because the Midnight War had two armies, and the other one answered to Rome. Far to the south, in a Vatican sub-office that appeared on no map of the Holy See, Section XIII, the Iscariot organization, God's own hidden blade, the zealots who hunted the monsters Protestant England was too soft to burn, received the same impossible readings within the hour. A village outbreak annihilated. A source that was neither demon, nor undead, nor blessed. A man who had appeared out of a tear in the sky itself. The PR. East they showed the file to was a giant of a man with a scarred face and round spectacles that caught the candlelight. And he read the report the way he read everything, as scripture or as target, with nothing in between. Not a vampire, Father Alexander Anderson murmured, turning the page. Not a devil, not an angel, oh the Lord, for the Lord Dosni announced his servants why holes in the heavens. He smiled, and the smile was its own kind of warning. Then it's a question, isn't it? And Iscariot has always been very good at putting questions to the blade. Two armies of the hidden war, Protestant and Catholic, monster and zealot, and on that night both of them, for the first time in their long and bloody rivalry, opened a file on the same impossible subject and stamped it with the same conclusion. Category unknown. Threat level unknown. Approach with maximum force. The subject of both files, meanwhile, had found the church. Saitama climbed the hill above the dead village mostly because it was the only building with its lights still on, and he was hoping, with the eternal optimism of a hungry man, that someone inside could give him directions. He pushed open the great oak doors of Cheddar's church and found, instead, the thing that had murdered the village. A young priest lounging on the altar in vestments soaked to the elbows in other people's blood, surrounded by the drained bodies of his congregation, his eyes burning ember red in the candlelight, and his fanged mouth curling into the smile of an apex predator, discovering that dinner had delivered itself. The vampire rose from the altar, drawing the darkness of the church around him like a cloak, and he spread his arms, and his voice came out in the velvet purr of a creature that had never once, in its new immortal life, been afraid. "Well, well," the vampire said, "another little lamb wanders in. Do you have any idea, little man, what you've just walked in on? Do you know what I am?" The candles guttered, the shadows crawled. "I am the night itself. I am your death come dressed in." "Do you know if there's like a convenience store around here?" Saitama said. "Or a supermarket, anything open late?" The vampire stopped. The shadows stopped with him. "And what?" "A store." Saitama mimed vaguely the universal gesture of holding a shopping basket. "Food. I just got here. I have no idea where here is. Everything's foggy. Everyone I've met so far was a zombie and I haven't eaten since." He counted on his fingers, gave up. "A while. You live here, right? You'd know." The vampire of Cheddar stood on his altar of corpses, the self-anointed god of a murdered village, and experienced, for the first time since the night he was turned, the sensation of not being taken seriously. It was not a sensation his new nature was built to survive. The ember eyes flared. The fangs came out in full. And with a shriek of wounded immortal vanity, the monster that had slaughtered 100 souls came off the altar at the speed of the dark itself, claws first, aimed at the bald man's unguarded throat. What the church's shadows witnessed then, they had no category for either. Saitama, without ever taking his hands off his hips, leaned out of the lunge, one small economical sway, the kind of motion a man uses to avoid a puddle. And as the vampire's momentum carried it past him, he brought one red-gloved fist around in a short, bored, pitying arc. The vampire of Cheddar did not die so much as conclude. The punch caught it mid-flight and converted it, instantly and totally, into a spray of crimson mist and drifting ash that blew the length of the nave, scattered across the pews, and settled gently, like the world's most disreputable snow, over the candles and the bodies and the bald man standing alone in the ruined church with his fist still loosely extended. Saitama looked at the settling ash. He looked at his glove. He sighed from the very bottom of his soul. "Punch," he said to the empty church, to the candles, to the indifferent gothic dark. "Even the vampire, one punch." He let his arm drop and trudged back down the aisle, shoulders slumped under the unbearable weight of his own strength, muttering as he went. New universe, spooky fog, zombies, vampires, big scary church. I really thought this place might have something. Just one guy who doesn't pop. He pushed open the oak doors onto the fog and the night and the dead village below. And there's definitely no store. He stood a moment in the doorway, a small, absurd silhouette of yellow against all that operatic dark, the strongest being in two universes, alone at the scene of a massacre he had ended without breaking stride, bored beyond the reach of every horror this world could offer. He did not know yet that the horror went deeper here than anywhere he had ever been. He did not know about the manor outside London, or the war room, or the priest with the blades already whispering his name in Rome, and he did not know, could not have known, that far beneath the English earth, in a basement where the shadows bowed to their tenant, the one being in this entire Gothic universe who could not be ended in a single punch, had just risen from his long stillness, red eyes burning in the dark, drawn up out of the deep by the scent of the impossible. The monster the monsters feared was awake, and he was coming to see the bald man for himself. In the deepest room of the Hellsing manor, behind a door that was less a barrier than a courtesy, the monster waited for his orders and thought, as he had thought for 500 years, about death. Not the deaths he dealt. Those had stopped meaning anything centuries ago, the armies and the assassins, the freaks and the fanatics, the endless procession of enemies who came against him certain of victory and left as stains. No, Alucard thought about the other death, the one that never came. He was the king of monsters, the no-life king, the nightmare that nightmares told stories about, and his great secret, the one truth he had never spoken aloud in 5 centuries of unlife, was that every battle he had ever fought, some buried sliver of him had walked into hoping, praying that this would be the one. That somewhere in the trembling ranks of humanity there existed a will strong enough, a hand steady enough, a being worthy enough to finally do what nothing had ever managed. To beat him, truly beat him, to grant him the one mercy immortality had stolen, an ending that meant something, dealt by hands that had earned it. No one ever was. That was the long, grinding tragedy of being Alucard. He had been defeated once long ago by a man, and that man was a century dead, and nothing since had come close. So he slept in his basement between his master's errands, and he killed what he was pointed at, and the hope had worn down over the decades into something thin and bitter and almost dead itself. Then came the night the instruments broke over a village called Cheddar, and his master descended the long stairs with a file in her hand and the smell of genuine uncertainty on her, Integra, who was never uncertain, and the thing in the basement listened to her describe an impossibility. 112 ghouls and a free-class vampire, Integra said, annihilated in under an hour by a single source that reads as human on every instrument we possess. No signature, no category. It is currently sitting in the ruins of the village, apparently waiting for a shop to open. She dropped the file on his table. The round table is in a panic. Iscariot is already moving. I want to know what it is before anyone else does. A pause, and then the words that were the whole purpose of his existence. Search and identify Alucard, and if it proves a threat to England, destroy it. In the dark, the red eyes opened fully, and the grin beneath them spread wide and white and hungry. A man, Alucard purred, who erases 100 ghouls in an evening and then waits for the shops. He rose from his chair, and the shadows of the room rose with him, flowing into the great red coat, the wide-brimmed hat, the orange glasses behind which the embers burned. "Master, you spoil me." He did not take the door. He fell through the floor like a stain sinking through cloth, and the night swallowed him, and across the sleeping miles between London and the dead village, the king of monsters traveled the way bad dreams travel, savoring, the whole way, a feeling he had almost forgotten the taste of. Curiosity. Saitama, at that moment, was sitting on the lip of the broken church fountain in the middle of the ruined village, holding a one-sided conversation with the traumatized police girl, who had refused to leave his vicinity on the entirely reasonable grounds that he was the only thing in Cheddar that killed monsters instead of being one. "So then the portal just opened," he was saying, "right in the middle of the street, and I figured, it's either a monster thing or an alien thing, and either way somebody's gotta check it out. So I looked inside." He shrugged. "Rookie mistake. Now I'm here, wherever here is." He glanced at Sira's. "You're sure there's no 24-hour anything?" It's 1999, Sira's managed. "It's Cheddar. There's a post office." "Unbelievable," Saitama said with feeling. And then the temperature fell. It fell the way it falls in the presence of the truly dead all at once, from the bones outward, and the fog in the village square began to move against the wind. Sira's felt it before she saw anything, a pressure, a wrongness, the deep mammal-brain certainty of being watched by something that considered her food. The shadows between the ruined houses thickened, stretched, gathered, pouring out of doorways and gutters and the spaces under things, flowing together in the center of the square into a shape, tall, coated, crowned with a wide-brimmed hat, and out of that gathering dark bled 1,000 whispering voices and a pair of eyes like open furnace doors, and beneath the eyes a grin, too wide, too white, too many teeth. It was an entrance refined across 500 years to do one thing, to unmake courage. Hardened soldiers had emptied their weapons and their bladders before that grin. Ancient vampires had abandoned their thrones and fled. The gathering of Alucard out of shadow was the opening movement of a symphony of fear, and it had never once in 5 centuries failed to land. "So," spoke the dark in a voice of velvet and graves, the whispers writhing beneath it, "you are the impossibility, the little man who unmade a village of the dead." The shape glided forward, boots not quite touching the cobblestones, the grin widening past the limits of any human face. "Do you know what I am, little man? Can your small mind even begin to grasp what has come out of the night to look upon?" "Oh good, another vampire," Saitama said. He didn't get up. "Hey, quick question. The last vampire blew up when I hit him. Are you a blowing up kind too, or are you actually gonna be worth standing up for? Because my feet hurt and this fountain's the first dry thing I've found all night." The whispers stopped. For the first time in 500 years, Alucard's entrance, the symphony, the masterwork of dread, was received the way a man receives a flyer handed to him on the street. Sira's, pressed against the fountain with every instinct in her body screaming run, watched the bald man squint up at the king of monsters with mild, hopeful interest, the way one squints at a vending machine, and she understood that one of the two beings in front of her was insane, and she genuinely could not have said which. Alucard tilted his head. The grin remained, but something behind it had gone very still, because he was reading the little man now, the way he read everything, the deep predator's sight that pierced flesh and bravado alike. In 500 years that sight had never failed him. Every soul he had ever faced was an open book of fears and hungers. The soldier's terror under his discipline, the priest's doubt under his faith, the vampire's desperation under his arrogance. Every living thing carried its darkness where Alucard could see it. He looked into Saitama and he saw nothing. No fear. Not suppressed fear, not conquered fear, an absence total and unnatural, like searching a house and finding it not merely empty but unbuilt. No bloodlust, no hatred, no darkness at all, only a vast, echoing, weary flatness, a boredom so profound and so old that it had worn the inside of the man smooth, And Alucard, staring into that emptiness, felt something cold move through his dead heart because he recognized it. It was his own. It was the precise shape of his own 500-year despair, the desolation of a being who has searched an entire world for an equal and found, again and again and again, that there is no one. The little man on the fountain was not unimpressed as an act. He was unimpressed the way Alucard was unimpressed. He had simply never, in all his life, met anything that could survive him. The grin came back wider than ever, and underneath it, for the first time in a century, the buried sliver of hope rolled over in its grave. "Stand up, little man," Alucard breathed, and the shadows began to boil off him, the whispers rising, the dark of the whole village bending in toward its king. "Stand up and show me. Show me what unmade cheddar. Show me what walks out of holes in the sky wearing boredom like a crown. Show me." The voice split, multiplied, thundered from every shadow at once as the monster spread his arms in glorious, blasphemous invitation. "Whether God has finally answered." Okay, geez, you're loud." Saitama stood up, rolled his shoulder, rolled his neck, set his feet with the weary professionalism of a man taking out recycling. Normal punch. He hit him. To Sira's Victoria, eyewitness, the event had no middle. There was a before in which the Red King of Monsters stood in his storm of shadows at the center of the square, and an after in which the storm was gone, the fog was gone, blasted outward in a perfect expanding ring, and the entire western half of the village of Cheddar wore Alucard. He was on the cottages. He was on the church. He was a fine crimson mist drifting over 3 streets, and a long red ruin painted up the hillside. And the sound of the punch was still rolling away across the countryside like the judgment of some vast, indifferent bell. Silence settled. Ash and red mist drifted down through the lamplight. "Huh," Saitama said, looking at the painted hillside. His shoulders began their long, familiar slump. "Yeah, blowing up kind. I really thought with the shadows and the voices and the whole." He waved a hand vaguely at where the theater had been. Production that maybe. The blood moved. It moved on the cottages and it moved on the church and it moved on the hillside. Every drop and ribbon of it all at once, flowing against gravity, against nature, streaming back across the square from 3 streets in every direction like a tide remembering its moon. The shadows came with it. The whispers came with it, thousands of them now, and they were not screaming. They were laughing. The blood gathered in the center of the square and climbed, building upward into boots, coat, gloves, the wide-brimmed hat, the grin arriving before the face around it, and Alucard stood whole in the lamplight once more, head thrown back. And the laugh that poured out of him was like nothing the Midnight War had ever heard from its most terrible weapon. Not mockery, not bloodlust. It was joy raw, unhinged, 500 years pent, the laughter of a man dying of thirst who has just felt rain. "Magnificent," the vampire roared at the night sky. He looked down at his own reknit hands, trembling, and back up at the bald man, and behind the orange glasses the furnace eyes were blazing wet. Do you have any idea how long?" The laughter took him again. He mastered it, and when he spoke next his voice had dropped to something raw and reverent and barely sane. 500 years. 500 years of insects, armies, empires. Men of God and monsters of the pit, and every last one of them broke, little man, every one, and you. He spread his arms wide, displaying his own restored body like a miracle at Mass. "You hit me gently, didn't you? That was a courtesy. That wasn't even the whole of you." "Well, yeah," Saitama said. "It was a normal punch. You should be glad. The serious ones are kind of a whole thing." And Alucard, king of monsters, terror of 2 armies, the leashed nightmare of the Hellsing organization, sank slowly to one knee in the center of the ruined square. Not in surrender, Sira's realized with dawning awe, but the way a knight kneels, the way the faithful kneel, and looked up at the small bald god in the cheap yellow jumpsuit with an expression that no living creature had ever seen on his face. Hope, terrible, ravenous, 500-year-old hope. "A serious one," the monster whispered, tasting the words like communion wine. "Then there is more, there is more. The grin spread one final time, wide as the night itself, and the whispering shadows curled around him like courtiers around a king who has just been told the war he longed for has finally come. "Oh, little man, little god in a yellow suit, you and I are going to know each other very well before the end. I have been waiting for you since before your world had a name." "Cool," Saitama said. "Do you know if anything around here is open?" Far away, in the manor outside London, every instrument in the Hellsing war room had just registered its second impossible event of the night. And Integra Wingate's Hellsing stood very still before the feeds, watching her family's ultimate weapon kneel in the ruins of Cheddar before a man her science insisted was ordinary. And she felt the cold premonition, bred into her bloodline across a century of midnight war, that the world she had spent her life holding in balance had just been tipped by something none of her categories could hold. She was right, and the tipping had only begun. Because the monster had found his miracle. And monsters, when they find the thing they have prayed 5 centuries for, do not let it go. The two strongest beings in 2 universes sat together in a murdered church, and for a long while, neither of them said anything at all. It was Saitama who had wandered back up the hill. The village had nothing else with a roof and working candles, and Alucard who had followed, drifting at his shoulder like a contented shadow, and now they sat among the pews in the guttering light, the bald god and the kneeling nightmare, while below them Hellsing's recovery teams swept the dead village and gave the church a wide, superstitious berth. Sierra's Victoria had been bundled off by medics who could not explain why she kept looking back up the hill. The fog had begun, finally, to thin. Saitama broke the silence the way he broke everything, bluntly and without ceremony. "Okay, I have to ask," he said. "Back there, I hit you and you went everywhere, like everywhere. You were on a hill and the whole time you were coming back together you were laughing." He turned to look at the vampire. "Nobody laughs when I hit them, mostly because they're dead, but still. So what's your deal? Why were you happy about it?" The grin that lived on Alucard's face shifted and then, slowly, did something it had not done in a very long time. It faded. Not into menace. Into something older and far heavier, and when the monster spoke, the velvet theater was gone from his voice, and what remained was just a voice deep, tired, and 500 years old. "Do you know what I am, little man?" "A vampire, the blowing." "Up kind, we covered this." "And the first of them." Alucard looked up at the broken altar, at the cross askew above it, and the candlelight burned in his glasses. There was a country once between the mountains and the old forests, and there was a prince who loved it savagely, the only way he knew how to love anything, and when the armies of an empire came to devour it, that prince made himself into a horror to stop them. He learned that fear was a weapon sharper than any sword. He raised forests of the impaled. He became the monster the invaders told stories about, and the stories were true, and he told himself every night of his bloody reign that the cruelty was the price of protecting what was his. The voice dropped lower, and when his country fell anyway, when his god did not answer, and his people abandoned him, and the executioner's blade came down, that prince, in his final moment, refused the death he had earned. He drank the blood off his own scaffold, spat in the face of God, and chose to become this instead. The candles guttered. The shadows in the church leaned in, listening to their king tell the oldest story he knew. "Dracula," Alucard said simply. "That was one of the names. There have been others. I have worn this on life for 5 centuries, little man, and I will tell you what no one in this world knows, what I have never said aloud in all that time." The furnace eyes turned from the altar and fixed on Saitama. Becoming immortal was the act of a coward. I understood it before the first sunrise. A man dies. A man stands at the end of his road and pays what he owes and ends, and there is a dignity in that ending that I spat upon because I was afraid. And the punishment for that cowardice has been perfect. The punishment is that I got exactly what I asked for. "Living forever," Saitama said. "Winning forever." The word came out like something wrought. "Do you understand what that is? I see that you might. For 500 years, everything that has come against me has broken. Armies, hunters, monsters, kings. I have been shot, burned, blessed, beheaded, staked, and unmade, and every time I come back, and every time they do not, and every victory is another year added to the sentence." He spread his white-gloved hands, and the gesture took in the church, the village, the centuries. "I was beaten once, truly beaten, 100 years ago by a man. A mortal man with crude tools and a will like the will of God, and he had me at the point of a stake with all my power spent. And do you know what I felt, lying there in the wreckage of everything I was? What? Relief. The word fell into the church like a stone into a well. Relief, little man, vast and total. The road was finally ending. The debt was finally coming due. I had been beaten by a worthy hand, by human will and human courage, by everything I abandoned on that scaffold, and the ending I had cheated was being handed back to me, and it felt not like defeat. It felt like forgiveness. A long pause. The grin tried to return and could not. And then they chose to chain me instead. The man's heirs bound me, leashed me, made me their weapon, and the weapon has served, and the decades have passed, and the man who beat me is dust, and there has never been another." He rose then, slow as moonrise, and walked to the broken altar, and stood looking up at the crooked cross with his hat in his hand. The king of monsters, bareheaded in a church, like any other tired pilgrim. "I have searched every battlefield of a century for one," he said quietly. "I goad my enemies. Did you know that? I let them hurt me. I give them every chance, every opening, hoping, praying, if a thing like me is permitted the word, that one of them will be enough. That somewhere in this world there is a will strong enough to put the old monster down for good and let the road finally end. They never are. They break, and I continue, and the sentence grows." He turned, and the candlelight caught his face, and for one moment the theater was entirely gone, and what stood at the altar was only a man who had been awake for 500 years and wanted, more than anything in creation, to sleep. And then a hole opened in the sky over a village called Cheddar, and out of it fell a man who hit me, gently, with more power than this entire world has shown me in 5 centuries. And you ask me, little man, why I laughed. The church was very quiet. "You laughed," Saitama said slowly, "because I might be the guy." "I laughed," Alucard said, "because God, who I spat upon, has either forgiven me or devised a punishment of genius, and I no longer care which." And Saitama, who had sat through the whole confession without a single joke, because even he knew the weight of a thing when it was finally set down in front of him, looked at the monster by the altar for a long moment, and then he sighed and rubbed the back of his bald head and said the thin, "Gee, the vampire could never have expected." "Yeah," he said, "I get it." Alucard went still. "You get it. The winning forever thing." Saitama looked down at his own hands, ordinary hands in cheap red gloves. "I wasn't always like this, you know. I was just a guy, couldn't get a job, no real point to anything. Then one day I decided I wanted to be a hero, like, actually decided, the way you decide something once in your whole life, and I trained. That's it. That's the whole story. 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, 10-kilometer run every single day until my hair fell out. 3 years," he flexed his fingers, closed them. "And somewhere in there something broke or finished. I don't know. I got so strong that nothing could touch me anymore. Anything I hit died, one punch, every time. Every monster, every villain, every strongest creature who ever lived, one punch. And a lot of them had really good speeches first too, so don't feel bad." "And the victories," Alucard said softly, watching him with those furnace eyes, "stopped tasting of anything." "Pretty fast, yeah." Saitama's voice stayed flat, but the flatness had a bottom to it now, and the bottom was a long way down. "People think being the strongest must be great. It's not anything. That's the problem. No fear because nothing can hurt you. No excitement because you can't lose. I used to feel my heart pound before a fight. I'd give, I don't know, a lot, to feel that one more time." He looked up at the vampire at the altar, and the two emptinesses regarded each other across the candlelight, each seeing its own reflection wearing the other's face. "You've been looking 500 years for somebody who can end you. I've been looking my whole life for somebody who can last. That's the same hole, man. We're just standing on opposite sides of it." "Yes," said Alucard, "we are." And he came down from the altar, and he stood before the small, bald god in the ruined nave, and he did the thing that 500 years of pride had never once permitted. He asked, "Then I will say it plainly as one empty thing to another." The voice was steady. The grin was gone entirely. "Fight me, Saitama. Not tonight. Tonight you have already shown me a fraction, and a fraction was the finest moment of my long damnation. I mean truly. When the moment comes, fight me with everything you have hidden behind that bored face. I will give you what you have starved for, every form, every soul, every horror of 5 centuries, all of it, holding nothing back. A fight that does not end in one blow. I am perhaps the only creature in any world who can give you that." He extended one white-gloved hand, palm up, not a threat, an offering. "And in return, at the end of it, when I am spent and broken and the road is finally at its end, you will not pull the blow. You will give me your serious punch, little god. You will beat me completely, the way I was beaten once 100 years ago. And you will let the old monster die at a worthy hand, the way he should have died on a scaffold 500 years ago. The hand did not waver. Your fight, my ending, both prayers answered with the same punch. That is the request. That is the only thing I have wanted since before your great-grandfather drew breath." The candles burned. The dead village lay silent below the hill, and Saitama looked at the offered hand of the king of monsters, and the church waited, and the shadows waited, and 500 years waited. "Huh," Saitama said. He didn't take the hand. He didn't refuse it either. He stood up, hands in the small of his back, and stretched until something popped, and his face did the thing it always did, which was almost nothing, but Alucard, who read souls the way scholars read books, saw what moved behind it. Not reluctance, not eagerness, something slower and heavier than either. A man being handed in the same moment the only thing he had ever wanted and a price tag he had not expected to feel. "That's a big ask, you know," Saitama said at last. "Not the fight. The fight sounds, honestly, the fight sounds amazing. I've got goosebumps. Look at this. I haven't had goosebumps in years." He held up an arm sincerely. "It's the other part. Heroes don't usually, the punching to death thing is normally reserved for, like, giant crab monsters. Not for guys I've sat in a church with." He looked at the vampire, and for once the flat voice carried something underneath it. "Ask me again when it's time. That's not a no. It's just I want to see the fight first. If you're really what you say you are, maybe the punch decides itself. And if you're not," he shrugged, "then you blow up like everybody else, and we never have to have this conversation again, and honestly that would be kind of sad. So don't blow up." And the grin came back to the face of the king of monsters, wide, white, and for the first time in 500 years, warm. "Little god," Alucard said, "I would not dream of it." It was at that exact moment, because the universe has a sense of timing, and it is always cruel, that the night outside the church changed. Both of them felt it at once, Alucard's head turning toward the south, the whispers in his shadows rising like startled birds, Saitama's eyes flicking to the window, the bored flatness sharpening to something almost alert. Far away, beyond the fog and the hills, something vast had begun to move. Engines in the night sky. A wrongness on the wind, marching in ranks. The smell, Alucard's nostrils flared around it, and grin twisted into something harder, of old fire, old hatred, and a war that the world believed it had buried 50 years ago. Said the monster softly. "It seems the fight will have to wait. Something has crawled out of history, little god, and it has brought an army." Saitama sighed, from the very bottom of his soul, and started for the church doors. It better have a store. 50 years before a bald man fell out of the sky over Cheddar, a war had ended, and somewhere in the dark places of the world, a small fat man in a white suit had simply refused to accept it. They had been the nightmare wing of the Reich once, a hidden battalion of scientists and butchers who had spent the war's dying years trying to bottle the midnight itself, to build vampires the way other men built tanks. History recorded them destroyed. History was wrong. They had fled into the world's blind spots and waited half a century, perfecting their blasphemy, growing their army of manufactured monsters one artificial vampire at a time. 1,000 of them now, a battalion of the undead in pressed uniforms. And at the center of it all sat their commander, round and smiling and soft-voiced, a man known only as the Major, who had kept his ruined organization alive across 5 decades for one reason, and one reason only. He loved war, not victory, war. The burning cities, the screaming skies, the beautiful machinery of slaughter. Victory ended wars, and so the Major had no use for it. What he dreamed of, what he had spent 50 years building toward, was a war that could never be won and never be lost. A war eternal. And on the night his spies brought him the footage from a dead village called Cheddar, a single ordinary man erasing 100 ghouls, splattering the great Alucard across a hillside with one board swing. The Major watched it 11 times in a row, hands folded on his belly, and began, very softly, to laugh. "Gentlemen," he whispered to his officers, eyes shining behind his little round glasses, "do you see what God has sent us? A man who cannot lose." The smile spread across his round face like an oil slick. "And what, gentlemen, is the one gift you can give a man who cannot lose?" No one answered. The Major's voice dropped to a lover's hush. "A war he cannot end." 3 nights later, the Zeppelins came to London. They slid out of the clouds after midnight, vast and impossible, blotting out the moon. And then the city's sirens began, and then they stopped, because the things that poured down out of the airships did not give the sirens time. 1,000 artificial vampires in 50-year-old uniforms fell upon the sleeping city with orders that consisted of a single word, and the word was everything. London began to burn from a dozen places at once. The Midnight War, hidden for a century behind Hellsing's careful silence, came roaring up into the open streets, and the screaming that rose from the city that night was the sound the Major had waited 50 years to conduct. Saitama was standing in a corner shop in Westminster, holding a basket, when the windows turned orange. He had finally found one, open late, fully stocked, the small miracle he had been questing toward since Cheddar. And he had 8 items in the basket and a genuine, modest happiness in his chest when the first Zeppelin's shadow rolled across the street outside and the first scream started, and the shopkeeper dove behind the counter, and Saitama stood in the canned goods aisle and listened to a city begin to die. He set the basket down very carefully, by the register, with a £5 note he'd found on the road under it. "Keep the change," he said, and walked out into the war. What he walked into, no comedy survived. The street outside was a gothic hell, fires climbing the faces of buildings, uniformed monsters moving through the smoke in disciplined ranks, machine-gunning the fleeing, feeding on the fallen, their eyes glowing ember-red beneath their caps, and the bored god went through them like a verdict. One punch, one punch, one punch. He cleared the street in 11 seconds. A dozen artificial vampires converted to drifting ash, and for one heartbeat he stood in the sudden silence feeling the old flicker of satisfaction. Then he heard the next street over, and the street beyond that, and the dozen streets beyond those, the whole vast wounded sprawl of London screaming from every direction at once, north, south, across the river, everywhere, 1,000 monsters loose among 8 million people, and Saitama, the man who had never in his life faced anything he could not solve with one arm, stood in the firelight and made the discovery this universe had been saving for him. It could not hurt him, nothing could, but it had never needed to. It only had to be everywhere he wasn't. He moved. He moved faster than this world had ever seen anything move, a yellow blur tearing from street to street, ending massacres in single blows, pulling families out of burning buildings between heartbeats. And it was not enough. That was the horror of it, the cold arithmetic that no amount of strength could break. Every second he spent saving the people in front of him, people were dying behind him. He cleared a square in Soho and heard, 3 streets back the way he'd come, the screams of a block he had saved 10 minutes ago, the monsters flowing back into the spaces behind him like water behind a man running through a flood. He punched a vampire off a mother and her son, and turned, and the other end of the street was already gone, already silent, already too late, and the silence of it followed him to the next street and the next. For the first time in years, Saitama's heart was pounding, and it was the wrong reason. It was the worst possible reason. He found Sierra's Victoria a little after 2 in the morning, in the ruins of a Hellsing column that had been ambushed on the Thames embankment. The recovery teams from Cheddar had been folded into the city's defense. Her squad had held a bridge for 40 minutes against odds that should have broken them in 5. And when Saitama got there, 11 seconds after he heard it begin, 11 seconds, faster than any living thing on Earth could have come, there was almost nothing left to save. Hellsing soldiers lay where they had stood. The bridge was carnage. And Sierra's, the police girl from Cheddar who had survived the unsurvivable village, was on her knees in the middle of it, bleeding, shaking, holding the hand of a dying sergeant who had taken the burst meant for her, screaming at the sky for a medic that was not coming. Saitama landed beside her. He looked at the bridge. He looked at the soldiers. He looked at the sergeant who looked back at him and managed with the last of everything 4 words. "You're the Cheddar fella," a red smile. "Heard you were fast." "Not fast enough," Saitama said quietly. "Faster'n anyone." The sergeant's eyes were already going somewhere else. "Look after the girl, she's new." And he was gone. And Sierra's made a sound that Saitama knew he was going to hear for the rest of his life. And the bored god of 2 universes stood on a burning bridge in a war he could not punch, surrounded by the dead he had been 11 seconds too late for, and felt fully, terribly, for the first time since his hair fell out, something. It was not the something he had spent years praying for. It was its opposite. It was helplessness, in a being built so that helplessness should have been impossible, and it tasted like ash. That was when every screen in London lit up at once. Every billboard, every shop window, every cracked television in every burning street, all of it flickering to the same image. A round, smiling man in a white suit, hands folded, gazing out at the city he was murdering with the tenderness of a connoisseur. "Good evening, London," said the Major in a voice like warm grease. "And good evening especially to our guest, the gentleman from the hole in the sky." The little glasses flashed. "I have seen your work, Main Froond, magnificent. A man who cannot be defeated, cannot be wounded, cannot be touched. You are, I confess, the answer to a prayer I have whispered for 50 years. He leaned toward the camera and the smile became the most obscene thing in the burning city. "You see, I do not fight to win. Winning ends the war. And you beautiful, impossible creature, you cannot lose. Do you understand what that makes you? You are the one enemy on Earth who can give me a war without end. Every monster you destroy tonight, I will make 10 more. Every street you save, I will burn twice. Not to beat you, never to beat you." The whisper dropped to something almost loving. "To keep you, forever, my perfect, undefeatable enemy dancing with my perfect, unwinnable war." The screens held on his smile 1 moment longer. "Oh, and do give my regards to the Hellsing organization," the Major added pleasantly. "Ask them when you see them why their true monster has not yet been let off his leash. I do so hope she does it soon. The night is still young, and I have saved my very best for him." The screens went dark, and across the burning city, in the war room of a manor under siege, Sir Integra Hellsing stood amid her dying organization with the Major's invitation ringing in her ears, and looked at the order she had prayed she would never have to give, the unsealing of the thing in her basement, the removal of every chain her family had spent a century forging, and lit her last cigar with steady hands. "Releasing control art restriction," she said, "to level 0. And far below the burning streets, in the dark beneath the dark, the king of monsters heard his master's voice, and the shadows of all London shivered as something 500 years old began, joyfully, to come fully awake for the first time in a century. On the bridge over the Thames, Saitama helped Sierra's Vic. Toria to her feet, and his face had changed. The boredom was gone. What had replaced it was something none of his enemies in any universe had ever been permitted to see, and the sight of it, even through her grief, made Sira's breath catch, because it was quiet, and it was simple, and it was utterly without mercy. "Hey, Sira's." His voice was flat and even and terrible. "That fat guy on the screens, the one who likes war so much." He rolled his shoulder once, and somewhere over the city the nearest Zeppelin's searchlights flickered, as if the night itself had flinched. "Where do I find him?" But the night had one more turn left in it, because at that exact moment, the dark across the river moved, all of it, every shadow on the south bank rising at once like a black tide standing up. And out of that tide came laughter that Saitama recognized, vast and joyful and mad, and a voice that rolled across the burning Thames like the tolling of a great bell. "Little God," roared Alucard, unbound, unleashed level 0, his form already dissolving into something enormous and wrong and wonderful, eyes blazing across the water like twin red dawns. "The leash is off. The war is here. Come and see what 500 years looks like when it stops holding back." And the dead of 5 centuries began to rise out of the king of monsters like an ocean given teeth, and London's longest night had only just begun. There are sights that end wars, and there are sights that begin religions, and what rose out of the south bank of the Thames that night was both. Level 0, the final unsealing. For a century, the Hellsing family had kept their monster bound in layer upon layer of restriction, and now every chain was gone at once, and London learned what the king of monsters had been holding in. Alucard came apart, gloriously, deliberately, his body dissolving into a tide of living darkness that poured across the river and up into the burning streets, and out of that tide came the dead, his dead. Every soul the no-life king had ever devoured in 500 years of damnation, kept inside him like coins in a vault. War horses and impaled knights, ancient soldiers, monsters, armies, 100,000 souls in marching ranks, erupting out of one being like a nation rising from a grave. The Major's artificial battalion had come to London expecting to fight an organization. Instead, the night itself stood up, and it had an army, and the army was smiling. And beside that tide of the dead, lit red by the burning city, stood a small bald man in a yellow jumpsuit, watching 100,000 ghosts pour past him into battle, and saying with deep sincerity, "Okay, that's pretty cool. Isn't it?" Alucard's voice came from everywhere now, from the tide, from the shadows, from the grinning dark itself, vast and joyful and finally unchained. 500 years, little God. 500 years of fighting at a fraction. My master's masters chained me so deep I had forgotten my own depths, and tonight the leash is off, and the enemy is endless, and you," the darkness convulsed with laughter, "you are about to learn what I learned at Cheddar. Come, Saitama. The Major has given us a war with no bottom. Let us see if even you can find the floor of it." And for the first time in years, the first true time since his hair fell out and his heart went quiet, Saitama got to fight. Not a fight that ended in one punch. That was the Major's accidental gift, the one thing no single monster in any universe had ever been able to offer him. Numbers. 1,000 artificial vampires, and behind them reinforcements without end, the Zeppelins disgorging fresh battalions, the dead rising as ghouls faster than they fell, a tide against a tide. One punch still killed everything it touched. But there was always another, and 10 more behind it, and for the first time in his remembered life, Saitama threw a punch and then, miracle of miracles, needed to throw a second one. Something woke up in him street by burning street. Sira saw it from the Hellsing lines and never forgot it. The bald man moving through the war like joy-given fists, faster and faster, the bored slouch gone, the flat eyes lit, and beside him, around him, with him, the tide of the king of monsters, the two of them carving the Major's endless war between them like partners in some vast and terrible dance. Alucard's legion swallowed a battalion. Saitama erased the next in a blur of single blows, And over the carnage, the monsters' laughter, and the heroes, Siras realized, hearing it for the first time, Saitama was laughing, rolled out across London together. "You feel it," the darkness roared at him, delighted as they tore through a square side by side. "I can see it on you, little god, the pounding heart, the aliveness. This is what we are for, not the leash, not the boredom, this is the best night of my life," Saitama shouted. D-back, punching a vampire into the next postcode, and meant every word, and somewhere beneath the joy of it felt the small cold weight that had been riding him since the church at Cheddar. Because the better the night became, the closer it carried them both to the morning, and to the request, and to the promise he had not yet decided whether he could keep. The dark joy lasted 1 hour more. Then the Major played his very best. It came without warning in the middle of the tide's greatest feeding. Alucard's darkness spread across half the city, devouring the Major's dead by the tens of thousands, swelling with every soul, and that, it turned out, had been the plan all along. Because seated deep in the Major's army, hidden inside one unremarkable corpse among a million, the mad scientists of Millennium had placed their masterpiece. Not a weapon that could kill the king of monsters. They had known for 50 years that nothing could, but something infinitely crueler. A poisoned soul. A thing engineered to be swallowed. A paradox grown in a tank for half a century, designed for one purpose: to be devoured by the great devourer, and then to unmake him from within. Alucard drank the sea of the dead, and somewhere in that sea, the poison went down with it. The first sign was the silence. The vast joyful laughter that had rolled across London all night. It stuttered mid-peal and stopped. The tide of darkness shivered, and then street by street the impossible began. The King of Monsters' legion started to fade, not falling, not dying, but thinning like smoke, like a photograph left in the sun. And at the center of his own dissolving ocean, Alucard reformed into his red-coated shape and looked down at his own white-gloved hands. They were becoming transparent. "Ah," said the King of Monsters softly, and the screens of London flickered on one final time, and the Major's round face appeared, shining with 50 years of consummated hatred, whispering like a lover. "Do you understand it yet, vampire? It is not death. Death you would welcome. I have read a century of files on you, monster. I know what you pray for, so I have not built you a death." The smile spread, obscene and triumphant. "I have built you an erasure. Existence and non-existence fed into you, unraveling you. No ending, no defeat, no worthy hand. You will simply stop. Everywhere and nowhere, undone, unmourned, unfinished, denied forever the one thing you wanted." The Major's voice dropped to a caress. 500 years of waiting for a beautiful death, monster, and you shall not even get an ugly one." And Alucard, fading, unraveling, his vast soul coming apart thread by thread across the London night, began, very quietly, to laugh. But it was not the joyful laughter of the tide. It was the other kind, the 500-year-old kind. The kind a man laughs at the bottom of the well when the rope is cut. "Of course," the monster murmured, watching his own hands dissolve. "Of course, even now, even this close, spat on God once and the bill never stops arriving." The furnace eyes found Saitama across the ruined square, and for the first time since Cheddar, since the church, since the request, the grin failed entirely. "Little God, it seems. I must withdraw my invitation, the fight you were promised." The voice itself was thinning now, fraying at the edges. "Forgive me. It appears I am to be cancelled instead." And Saitama looked at the unraveling King of Monsters, at the only being in 2 universes who had ever survived him, the only opponent he had ever sat in a church with, the monster who had asked him for an honest ending and was now being robbed of even that. And something in the bald god's face went very still and very simple. "No," Saitama said. He said it the way other men state laws of physics. "Nobody erases you. That's not no, you don't get to just disappear." He was already moving, walking into the dissolving tide of darkness, into the heart of the unraveling where no living thing could have stood. "You asked me for an ending, a real one. You knelt in a church and asked me, and I said ask me again when it's time, which means we have an appointment, man. You and me. The fight, and then the question, and then whatever I decide." His voice did not rise, and that was what made it terrible. "And some guy in a white suit does not get to steal my fight." "Little God," the fading dark whispered, "there is nothing to punch. It is inside me. It is unmaking, not flesh." "Everything something," Saitama said. And the strongest being in two universes closed his eyes, in the center of a dissolving soul ocean, and listened, the way he had listened to 1,000 monsters' heartbeats, the way instinct beyond instinct had guided his fists since the day his hair fell out, listened past the screaming threads of 500 years of devoured souls, down and down into the dark of the king of monsters, until he found it. The wrongness. The one soul in the ocean that did not belong, the paradox in the tank-grown corpse, the Major's 50-year masterpiece, swimming in the deep of Alucard like a worm in a god. Saitama drew back his fist, and for the first time in this universe, he did not throw a normal punch. What he threw, no instrument recorded and no witness could describe, a blow of such absolute, surgical, impossible precision that it passed through the unraveling dark without disturbing a single one of the 100,000 faded souls, through the layered deeps of a 500-year-old monster's being, and struck one thing, and one thing only, a paradox the size of a heart, hidden at the bottom of an ocean of the dead. The Major's masterpiece, 50 years in the growing, ceased to exist in rather less than a second. The unraveling stopped. The threads of the king of monsters, frayed to the last fiber, shivered, held, and began slowly to weave themselves home. Across London the fading legion surged back to solidity. The tide of darkness deepened back to true black. And in the center of it Alucard reformed, whole, opaque, real, staring at his own restored hands, and then at the small bald man standing in the heart of his soul like it was a bus stop. You, for once, for the only time, the king of monsters had no theater at all. You reached into the deep of me, past every soul I have ever taken, and you unmade my unmaking. The furnace eyes were wide. Why, you held my request in your hands, little God. You had only to do nothing, and the question I asked you in that church would never have needed answering. I was being taken off your conscience. Why? And Saitama looked at him, at the monster he'd sat with in a ruined church, the mirror on the far side of the same hole, and shrugged, and said the truest thing anyone had said in the whole long war. Because that wasn't the ending you asked for. The screens of London were still on, the Major was still watching. And the round little man in the white suit, who had spent 50 years building a war without end and one perfect erasure, watched his masterpiece die in a single blow, and his eternal war begin to collapse around him, watched the monster he had failed to unmake, and the man he had failed to keep turned together, toward his zeppelin in the burning sky, and learned in his final hour the lesson the Major of all people should have understood from the start. He had prayed for an enemy who could not lose, and his prayer had been answered, both halves of it. The end of the Major's war was brief, and it does not need much telling. A zeppelin falling in flames over the Thames, a fat man in a white suit meeting in his last moments, the one being his beautiful eternal war could not contain, and dying to his credit, and to his horror smiling because even his own ending was magnificent. By the hour before dawn it was over. The artificial battalions were ash on the wind. The fires were burning down. London, wounded and weeping, would live. And on a rooftop above the smoldering city, in the gray-violet stillness before sunrise, the king of monsters and the bald god stood side by side, looking east. "The night is almost over, little god," Alucard said quietly. The theater was gone. The joy of the war was gone. What remained in the ancient voice was the thing that had been waiting underneath it all along, patient and weary and 500 years old. "You saved my ending tonight, which means you know, better than anyone in two worlds, that it still belongs to me." He turned, and the first gray light caught the edge of the old grin, softer now, almost kind. "You owe me a sunrise, Saitama. And I am owed a question's answer." Saitama looked east at the lightning sky for a long moment. The goosebumps were back on his arms, so was the weight. "Yeah," he said, "I know. What he would answer, what the man who had never lost would decide to do with the only friend who had ever asked him to win, not even Saitama knew, as the sun came up over London. But the appointment had come due. Working from the style guide, the finale comedy fully gone now, pure gothic stillness, the duel as ceremony. Here's segment 6. Segment 6, the gift. They chose a field an hour north of London, where the war had not reached and the dawn would arrive unbloodied. And before the two of them left the smoldering city, the king of monsters knelt one last time before his master. Integra Hellsing had commanded Alucard for half her life. She had inherited him the way her family inherited everything, as a weapon, a burden, and a damnation. And she had read, in her century of family archives, every report ever written on the thing in her basement. So when her monster knelt in the gray pre-dawn and told her what waited in the field up north, and what he had asked of the bald man, and why, she did not argue, and she did not weep, because she was a Hellsing, and because she had always known in the way. One knows a thing without ever once saying it, that her servant had been searching every battlefield she sent him to for the one enemy who would not break. 100 years of my family's chains, she said quietly, and in the end you needed our permission for nothing but this. On the contrary, master, the old grin gentled almost past recognition. It is the only permission that ever mattered. Integra Fairbrook Wingate's Hellsing looked down at the monster that had served her bloodline for a century, her nightmare, her weapon, her oldest and strangest companion, and gave her final order in the steady voice of a knight of the realm, and it was 3 words long. You are released. And so the dawn found them in the field, the no-life king at one end, the bald god at the other, wet grass between them, the eastern sky going gold. And there were no armies now, no burning city, no audience but a single Hellsing car parked far off on the lane, where Integra stood smoking in the cold and Sierra's Victoria stood beside her, not entirely sure why she was crying already. You came, Alucard said. I said I would. Saitama stood with his hands at his sides, the cape stirring faintly. His face was doing the thing it always did, which was almost nothing, but the almost had weight in it this morning. I still haven't decided, about the end part. The fight, yeah, but the other thing, he paused and said it plainly because plainness was the only honesty he owned. You're sort of my friend, man. I've punched a lot of things. I never once punched a friend. I know, the vampire's voice was warm. 500 years and it had taken the last night of them to learn warmth. So I will ask you the question I asked in the church, little god, as I was told to, one last time, and you will answer it the only way you have ever answered anything. The red coat began to stir, though there was no wind. With your fists, honestly. And then the king of monsters drew himself up to his full height, and spread his arms to the rising sun he had not stood beneath in 500 years, and let go of everything. What rose out of Alucard in that field was all of it, the full and final shape of 5 centuries, held back from every war he had ever fought. The 100,000 souls, the seas of darkness. The hound, the eyes, the storm of him, vast as weather, the prince and the impaler and the dragon and the monster, every form he had ever worn and every life he had ever taken, gathered into one last colossal act of total war. Not to win, never to win, but to give. To be, for one fight, the opponent that the loneliest hero in 2 universes had trained his heart out for and never found. Come Saitam, the storm roared in a voice of joy and graves and 500 years of waiting. No Elias, no fractions, no mercy. Show me the whole of you and I will show you mine. And Saitama, the man who had not been allowed a real fight in so long that he had forgotten the taste of his own pounding heart, felt it rise in him like a sunrise of its own, the thing he had given everything for and lost by winning, the aliveness, the fear that's his joy, the beautiful uncertainty of an opponent who would not vanish at the first blow. He smiled and he went. There are no words for the fight, and so the story does not pretend to have them. The field did not survive it. The hills around it did not survive it. For the better part of an hour in the gold and rising light, two impossibilities gave each other the gift that no other being in any universe had ever been able to give: everything, and the land for miles recorded the conversation in craters. Alucard threw 500 years at the bald god. The legions, the darkness, the 1,000 deaths he had devoured, blow after blow after blow that would have cracked the world's other heroes like eggshells. And Saitama took it all and laughed, heart hammering, blood singing, fully and finally awake, and answered and answered and answered. The monster was unmade 40 times and remade 40 times, laughing louder each time. The hero was struck by powers that had toppled empires and felt them, and wept with gratitude even as he swung. It was not a battle. Ceres understood that, watching from the lane with her hands over her mouth. It was a conversation between the only two beings who spoke the language, and it was a farewell, and both of them had known it from the first blow. The end came the way they both knew it would. There is a bottom to everything, even to 500 years, and Alucard reached his in the field's great central crater as the sun cleared the hills. His legions spent. His seas of darkness drained to one last red-coated shape, kneeling in the torn earth, ruined, emptied, finished, and grinning up at the man standing over him with more peace in his ancient face than any creature had ever worn. There, the monster whispered. Blood, his own at last, ran from the corner of the grin. There it is, the bottom of me, 500 years, little god, and you are the first to find it. The furnace eyes were soft now and very tired and very young, the eyes of a prince on a scaffold long ago being offered a second chance at the only door he should ever have walked through. It was a magnificent fight, the fight of both our lives. And now, he straightened his back, kneeling there in the wreckage, and lifted his chin, the way a knight kneels, the way the faithful kneel. Now, my friend, ask yourself the question one last time, and answer honestly. Saitama stood over him in the morning light, breathing hard, the gift of it, the miracle of it, and looked down at the only opponent who had ever lasted, the only being who had ever sat with him in a ruined church and understood the whole from the other side, the friend who had fought beside him through a burning city and asked him for one thing only: a worthy ending, at a worthy hand, the death he had been owed for 500 years, that an executioner had been cheated of, that a fat man in a white suit had tried to steal, preserved through everything, for this field, for this morning, for him. Heroes don't kill their friends. That was the code, and it was a good code, and Saitama had carried it through 2 universes. But heroes keep their promises, and sometimes, once in 500 years, the same act is both. Yeah, Saitama said quietly. His fist drew back and the morning light caught it, and for the first time in his existence, the gesture carried no boredom at all. It carried everything. Okay, man, you earned it. Best fight ever. The best, Alucard agreed, closing his eyes, face lifted to the sun. Thank you, Saitama. The serious punch, the first true one, the one no universe had ever required, made no sound that anyone present could afterward describe. Ceres only remembered the light. Integra only remembered that the cigar fell from her fingers and she let it lie. And in the great crater in the gold of the morning, the no-life king, Dracula, the impaler, the prince of the lost country, the monster who had spat at God and spent 500 years paying for it, came apart for the final time. Not erased, not unmade, but ended, beaten utterly and honestly by the worthiest hand in 2 universes, dissolving into ash and red light that rose into the sunrise like a held breath released at last. And the very last of him to go was the grin, and the grin, at the end, was simply a smile. The wind carried him east into the morning. The field went quiet. The war was over, and so was the longest sentence ever served. Saitama stood alone in the crater for a long time. He had won. He always won. That was the curse that had always been the curse, but this was the other thing, the thing he had never once had, a victory that weighed. He had gotten everything he had ever prayed for in that field. The fight of his life, the pounding heart, the opponent who lasted. And the price of it was that there would never be another, because the only being in two universes who could give Saitama a real fight was the same one who had needed Saitama to end him, both prayers, answered with the same punch, exactly as the monster had promised in the church. He looked at his fist, he looked at the ash on the wind. "One punch," he said softly to the empty morning, and for the first time in his life the words didn't taste like boredom. They tasted like grief and like gratitude and like the name of a friend. Then the strongest being in two universes climbed out of the crater and gave the two women on the lane a small, awkward wave and walked away into the gold. A small, absurd silhouette in a cheap yellow jumpsuit, carrying the heaviest victory anyone had ever won, the hero who had finally felt everything, alone again under a risen sun. Somewhere behind him, in the light over the field, the wind settled. The monster had wanted to die at worthy hands. The hero had wanted a fight worth feeling. In the end, in a universe that was kind in the cruelest possible way, each of them had been the answer to the other's prayer all along, and the proof of it was a quiet field in England where the ash of a 500-year-old king rose into the sunrise, smiling, finally beaten, finally forgiven, finally free.